Welcome to this common sacred space. Common because we are all welcome. Sacred because here we transform the ordinary and attend to the profound. We carry with us our regrets, doubts, fears, stories, laughter. May they inspire our worship. Above all, may we each meet what we need most to find on this day in this common sacred space.
As the first reading, we have a few pieces that I'm going to read for you. Story is umbilical cord that connects us to the past, present, and future family. Story is relationship between the teller and listener, a responsibility. Story is affirmation of our ties to one another. By Terry Tempest Williams, Piece of White Shell. Next piece is saying, we tell stories to talk out the trouble in our lives. Trouble otherwise so often so unspeakable. Is one of our main ways of making our lives sensible. Trying to live without stories can make us crazy. They help us recognize what we believe to be most valuable in the world and help us identify what we hold demonic. By William Kittredge, Holding Sky, a memoir. Next piece says, from my perspective as deaf psychologist, I see that those who have a connection with story are in better shape and have a better prognosis than those to whom story must be introduced. This is a large statement, and I would like to take it apart in several ways. But I do not want to diminish its apodictic claim. To have story awareness is per se psychologically therapeutic. It's good for soul. By James Hillman. Next one says, stories are like spiders with all their long legs, and stories are like spider webs, which man gets himself all tangled up in, but which look pretty when you see them under a leaf in the morning dew, and in the elegant way that they connect to one another, each to each. By Neil Gaiman, Anansi Boys.
In my first real job after college, I went to work for a man who owned a small retail business and shared with me his philosophy on how to be successful in his business. He would say, everyone has a story to tell. Your job is to learn their story. Get their story, and you will get their business. Now, as I say that, my stomach is kind of tight at how crass that sounds right now. It didn't sound so crass to a 20-something who had just graduated from college and was stepping into his first job and wondering what was next. I also realized that you don't have nearly as much context as I do. In the time that I worked for Robert, I would watch and listen to him interact with people, administrative assistants, office managers, clerks, calling them by name, asking about their families, their children, recalling their children's names, asking them about their latest activities, recalling stories about them. Hey, Danny, show Dave your ring. And Danny would bring up his championship ring for playing for the Crimson Tide. And then he would start recalling Danny's story with him. He said, you remember that game, and you did this, and that's what happened? And then pretty soon, Danny would take over and start telling the story. And pretty soon, we were all just feeling connected and comfortable with one another. And it wasn't so much about business. It was more about the relationship. I became comfortable with Robert's everyone has a story philosophy because I witnessed his sincerity as we went out on sales calls together and as he mentored me and we delivered goods to merchandise to customers. Not to romanticize Robert, he was a businessman. And there was a tactical approach to his learning everyone's story. But he was also a very kind and sincere and authentic man. And he was expressing that part of him that was relational and caring and directed towards elevating another person simply by taking interest in their story and listening to it. And not just listening to it, but remembering it and recalling it with them. Robert taught me that stories are important. And in the years since I worked for him, the truth of everybody has a story has become a part of my own DNA. It has settled into my body, in my soul, in my spirit. Not as a tactic, but because I truly believe that at the end of the day, what is truly holy about us are our stories. In seminary, I was introduced to narrative theology, which seeks to access God or the divine through narratives about God that are told in sacred texts. For narrative theology begins in story rather than doctrines or propositions or presuppositions about God. So if you want to know about Jesus, then you begin reading the stories. You read the Gospels, and they give you evidence of who this person is. That seemed a better way for me than beginning with the assumption that doctrine always seemed to be for me. I could get behind the Jesus who talked about the poor and the blessed, how blessed they were, and that we should love one another and we should feed our neighbors and we should take care of one another. I wasn't quite as sure about the Jesus who ascended into the right hand of God the Father Almighty, maker of heaven and earth. And as I've, in the last few years, have reflected on my own spiritual path, I have managed to see that the golden thread that has taken me from being United Methodist to a part of the emergent church in the Christian faith to settling into this place as a Unitarian Universalist who identifies with Buddhist faith and practice as well. I feel at home here. And I feel at home here because of the profound conviction in the sacredness of our stories. The conviction that we all have a story to tell. And that our gathering here together is based not on doctrine, not on creeds, but on the stories that we share. That we are all seeking truth, and that we all have in mind the inherent worth and dignity of others. As I listen to colleagues wrestle in their denominations with questions about, are people in the LGBT community worthy of calling themselves Christian? I think, that's a no-brainer. We've taken that off the table. Because we begin with the inherent worth of all people. We all have a story to tell. And our stories are what shape our lives by telling us who we are, by bringing us into relationship with others, and providing a common container for our shared humanity. And this is what helps us nurture and maintain the connections that we have with one another. If we truly affirm the inherent worth and dignity of all people, and our stories are connected to that, then our stories, each of them, is a story of profound dignity and worth. We are the story. It occurred to me today as we were sharing joys and sorrows that we seem to spend an awful lot of time these days looking at data and facts. And sometimes I think we mistakenly think that the truth is related to facts and facts alone, or data and data alone. I was reminded today as we went through the joys and sorrows that it's more than just a sharing of information, because with each joy and sorrow that was shared, there's a bigger story behind that. And I think in the sharing of our joys and sorrows with one another, that's the invitation to the larger story. I can imagine that each of us are connected to what we shared today in our own ways. We're human beings. We've all been touched by illness. We've all lost loved ones. We've all lost special loved ones, pets. We've all had our bouts with illness, and we've had loved ones recover from illness. But it's our stories around all of this that help us make meaning of our lives and what it means to be a human being on this very strange planet. Jerome Berryman is an Episcopal priest who was very much influenced by the work of Maria Montessori. And in his work, he developed a way of telling sacred stories. It was an interactive way of telling sacred stories for children. It was a way to help them develop language around spiritual matters that they don't always have ready. It was a way of teaching them the sacred stories in the Christian faith. It was a way for them to begin to express what they experienced of the divine in their own encounter with the divine. It was in telling the story, it is in listening to the story that Berryman figured out that it's not a story to be grasped, but it is a story to be lived. And so the whole idea is that as you're sitting with these children around you and you begin telling a sacred story, your focus is on the story. The storyteller is incidental. And by doing that, the children begin to immerse themselves in the story. And then they begin to identify with different parts of the story. So if you're telling the story of the Good Shepherd, and you were to ask a child, I wonder which part of this story is about you, they would begin to talk about that. And the really beautiful thing is that they would be able to share their experience of that. In a way that helped them deal with all of those existential things that we human beings have to deal with. The work of Jerome Berryman was influenced by Maria Montessori. The listening stones that I shared with the children today were developed by another person who was kind of connected to Jerome as well. I like the listening stones because they're not specifically of one faith, that you can use them with people of all faiths. Our own spirit play that we use in the UU Church was developed out of the same idea, that as a way to encounter the sacred stories in our lives and to develop language around our experience of the divine or the transcendent or the transformative. It's not that they have to learn the experience. They have the experience. It's there. What they don't have is the language for it. Sacred stories offered a way of knowing not only the encounters with the divine, but the encounters with those existential issues that each of us face. Death. The sense that at times we feel very much alone in the universe. The need for us to make meaning of our experiences, to make sense of what we experience. And the fact that we are limited and finite beings who sometimes have to address issues that take us beyond ourselves into the unknown. And that the freedom that we have also comes with a tremendous angst of responsibility for those choices we make. When a mother in the ICU has to decide, based on very limited medical information, whether she should allow her child to have an operation or procedure, not knowing the outcome, but also knowing that without this procedure, nothing good will be achieved. And the courage it takes to step in that. All of these things are connected to our stories. Our stories become the container for all of our experiences. They become the container that these experiences go into, and then there's this alchemy that happens where our stories are told and they're retold and they're swirled in with all of the other experiences of our life. And somehow, out of this container comes some sense of meaning about what it is to be a limited, finite human being in this world who is of infinite worth and dignity, that we came into the world with it. It's in the container of our stories that we feel less alone, and that we will somehow manage to face that one thing that each of us will face at one point in our life. That we came into the world knowing that at one day our life will end, and somehow make meaning of that as well. My birthday was last Monday. I turned 57. It was a wonderful, awful day. I got to spend time with friends, and that was the wonderful. But I suddenly had several realizations at the end of the day. I realized I was getting older. Don't know why it didn't occur to me before. I realized that my body doesn't do now what it did when I was fresh out of college and traveling around in a van with Robert, my first boss. I've been told you're not to worry until that moment when you have what's been known as the sleep injury. Have anyone experienced that, where you pull a muscle just rolling over in bed? So I'm beginning to worry now. But I think what concerns me more than anything, as I have reached a place in my life where I'm beginning to kind of slow down and kind of take a look at where I've been and look at my own story, is that I don't want it to be a story that is marked by data or facts only. I think in order to call something sacred, it has to be about more than that. But we live in an information age. And so I'm learning to become patient when I sit with somebody and I begin to get their story. And when I begin to ask, how are you doing? And I know that the first 10 minutes of our conversation will be about data and information, blood pressure, physical ailments. But I also know if I just wait, and continue to listen, that a story will emerge. And when it does, I begin to feel a connection. And as I continue to listen, I begin to realize that there is something about this person that resonates with me. If nothing else, in our shared humanity. And I began to realize that I'm beginning to fall deeper in love with another person whom I've never met before. And in some sense, I begin to love myself more deeply as well. I like that. It feels really nice. It's been said that if each person on this planet were just to listen to another person's story and attend to it the way they attend to their own, that this world would be transformed. I like that too. So if I meet you in the hallways here and ask you how you're doing, it's fine to share with me data. But just know I may linger, and I may encourage you to tell me a little bit more. Please know this is not a tactic. This is my way of loving you and asking you to love me.